Hello, this is Professor Keith Ross from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, continuing a series of lectures for my classes. This lecture is going to be for my police studies class, and what we're going to discuss today is Chapter 4, Law Enforcement Agencies, and more importantly, their organizational charts and how they're sort of organized and how they operate. So I'm going to start with slide number 3. I'm going to be skipping around a bit in this chapter because there's sort of a lot of organizational charts, and I don't really feel like we need to go through each and every one of them. I think one suffices because they all sort of look and operate the same. Basically, it's the organization is highly structured and tends to be militaristic. Easy enough. There are 3 key points to keep in this chapter. First, the events of September 11, 2001 drastically changed the organization of the federal law enforcement apparatus and their missions. If you look into the history of what the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, what their main investigations were up until September 10th, 2001, they really sort of investigated white-collar crimes and organized crime. That was sort of their purview. That's what they looked to do. Obviously, the tragic events of September 11th, 2001 took place, and their core mission changed to still doing the crime stuff, but also to counter terrorism. Secondly, each agency and each type of agency has its own mission, domain, issues, and interagency relationships. What this sort of means is every police department has an interagency relationship with their district attorney's office and in turn with their correctional systems. They all have to sort of operate together. Sometimes they play well in the sandbox, sometimes they don't, but they do have to operate with each other. They don't operate in a vacuum. Finally, in light of recent reform events, traditional approaches to organizing law enforcement agencies may have become outmoded. And currently, not only are we talking about organization, but core missions as well. Federal government has a number of its own enforcement agencies, as does each state government. If we're looking on the federal level, I mean, we there's just a few offhand, and I mean, there's I think over 200 or 300 different law enforcement type agencies, but there's the FBI, there's the CIA, there's the Department of Homeland Security, there's ICE, many others. So they all just realize that there are definitely different agencies, and each agency has its own mission. They might do or investigate similar things, but normally not. They try and specialize. Additionally, county and municipal agencies can be all across the country, including specialized agencies that don't necessarily fit neatly into any governmental agency. County and municipal level and state level. Here's a quick example for those of my students that reside in the borough of Queens and you drive. If you get onto the Clearview Parkway, the Clearview Expressway, excuse me, depending on which way you travel, on one side of that highway, usually heading towards Long Island, there'll be a New York State trooper. On the other side, heading towards the bridges into the Bronx, there'll be NYPD Highway. 2 different agencies sort of doing similar things. Counting the number of law enforcement agencies in America is not unlike counting the number of citizens. Right now in 2020, there is an effort to conduct the census and get people to register with the census, but does everybody participate? My assumption is no. So those census numbers are always lower than actual numbers. Well, sort of the same thing in law enforcement agencies because especially with economic factors, there are times where agencies will expand, they'll compact, maybe they'll merge with one another, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The census of people living in the United States always falls short. We talked about that. And I also talked about merging municipalities. Now, here's an example of that. Merging municipalities, let me just read it, and shrinking towns can lead to the combination or elimination of police departments. About every 10 or 15 years in New York City, there will be a politician that will sort of try and subscribe to the idea of merging the police department, the NYPD, the police department, and the New York City Department of Correction. Merge them together and create some sort of like public safety office that does the purpose of both, that does police and correctional duties. Now, on one hand, that might be a good idea. Why might it be a good idea? Because now we're combining and pooling resources. So the monies that went to the police department and the monies that went to corrections now flow in the same exact agency. And there might be other reasons why something like this might work. Let's say you have a police officer, that police officer gets into some kind of trouble. Maybe it's an off duty incident, maybe it's an on duty incident, maybe some sort of domestic issue at home. That police officer now loses his or her firearm for a period of time. They are quote unquote modified. Well, right now, usually what police officers who are modified and what they do, they'll either perform administrative tasks where they work, or they'll man cameras and TVs in what's called Viper locations. Basically, these are locations monitoring housing developments to make sure that the residents of the housing developments are safe. So instead of doing that, what we could do is take that police officer, because he or she does not have a firearm, and put them into the correction side of this Office of Public Safety. And then they can perform enforcement functions inside the jail, because when you perform enforcement inside a jail or a prison, those correctional officers are not armed, and for good reason. I mean, it's safety for staff, it's safety for inmates, something like that. On the other side of the coin, and I'm very big on this, if you're going to analyze a problem, you have to look at both sides. You can't just look at one side and say, hey, this is where I want to be. You have to understand the logic of the other side. Okay, well, here's an issue that might present itself on the other side. At least in the NYPD, the normal rate of a police academy class is 6 months. Now, in that 6 months, there's a lot of training. That training talks about legal, procedural stuff, and sort of humanistic or social interaction stuff. And in addition to that, there's an emergency driving component. There's a firearms training component. There's other components, and then there's a field training component, and that all has to get fit into sort of a 6 month package. On the correctional side, well, I believe it's anywhere. I think it's been expanded, but with every class, it gets longer or shorter depending on what the executive staff sort of sees as their vision at the time. So that corrections class goes anywhere from 3 to 5 months, including their field training component. So now what do we do? If we now have this Office of Public Safety that encompasses both police and corrections, well, do we have a 9 month class? Well, that might take too long. So now what do? Well, we're going to maybe use the police model, and we're going to do a public safety course for our recruits in 6 months. Well, now what has to happen? Well, what has to happen is I have to pick and choose the things that I'm going to omit from that police curriculum and the things that I'm going to omit from the correctional curriculum. So you have to choose. And what do you choose? Are you saying that you were teaching stuff that wasn't important? If it wasn't important, why was it included in the curriculum anyway? Usually there is a good reason. And sometimes a majority of the time, there's a reactionary reason that some incident takes place. The departments have to address it, and usually the way they address it is via training. So now we have this 6 month public safety course where we've compacted the police curriculum and compacted the corrections curriculum. Well, are there going to be things that get missed? The answer to that is probably going to be yes. So that might be one of the issues there. Okay, I am on slide number 6, and this is just a list of federal agencies. I am not going through all of this DHS and Secret Service stuff and Customs and Border Protection. It's nice to read. I don't really think we need to know it. What I would like to do is take a look at slides number 14 and 15. 14 and 15 are what are known as organizational charts, showing the actual structure of how these departments work. Now, if we're taking a look at slide number 14, on top, there is a director. The director is the number one. This director, he or she is responsible for making important decisions about the mission, about procedures, how things work in their agency. Now, if you notice laterally, the director has a chief of staff. Well, this chief of staff is probably his or her number two. So if the director has an issue and maybe they need guidance, they'll probably go to their chief of staff. Now, directly underneath the director is a deputy director. And what we're looking at here in 14 is the FBI's organizational chart as it looked in 2016. And organizational charts evolve over time. So I wouldn't be surprised if 2020's FBI organizational chart looked a little bit different. Underneath the director is the deputy director. Now, the deputy director, just like the chief of staff, is his or her number two. In the absence of the director, the deputy director assumes the responsibilities of the director. And laterally to him or her is the special agent in charge. And the special agent in charge is probably the one who has the sort of the operational responsibility of all the field agents that are out there. And then if you look, it sort of trickles down. That's how these organizational charts sort of look. Chart number 15, we have the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. Sort of looks the same thing. We have a number one, then we have a number two, a number three, and then sort of the rank and file. You have your midline supervision. So I am at slide number 17. Centralized state police agencies generally do the following. What's an example of a centralized police agency? The New York State Troopers. That is New York State Police. They are a centralized police agency. They generally do the following. They assist local law enforcement departments in criminal investigations when asked to do so. Now, let's think about New York as a state. Now, for those of you that are New York City residents, we reside in a city of on or about 8 million people. So that's a big population, and the NYPD in of itself is a big organization. The numbers sort of, rise and ebb. We're probably at about 34 to 35,000 members of the New York City Police Department, both sworn or uniform members and civilian staff. But there are other sort of small police departments out there that have maybe a staff of 10. Off the top of my head, I think like Warwick, New York has a very small police department. So if you have a staff of 10 people, probably, or 10 uniform officers, most of those officers can probably conduct criminal investigations, but I'm going to assume that the Warwick Police Department doesn't have its own crime scene lab, its own crime scene bureau. Maybe it might not even have its own detective staff to conduct follow-up investigations. In a case like this, what will they do? Well, they will reach out to the New York State Police, and the New York State Police will provide assistance. Operate identification bureaus, maintain a centralized criminal records repository. Most of you have had experience with New York State Police on this next one, patrolling the state highways, possibly getting pulled over in Westchester or higher up in New York State, and provide select training for municipal and county officers. If I remember correctly, the New York State Police Academy is in Valhalla, New York, and they provide training for all the small county departments all around upstate New York, Westchester, Putnam, Orange. So if they don't have their own training bureaus, they train with the New York State Police Academy. Okay. Decentralized state agencies, slide number 19, are most prevalent in the southern United States. I don't really care too much about this. Structure varies from state to state. It's up to the state to decide how they want to do that. What I would like to do, okay, I'm going to just briefly talk 20. The term local agencies encompasses a wide variety of organizations. Municipal police departments and sheriff departments are most familiar. Now, other than the New York City Sheriff's Department, most sheriff's departments conduct criminal investigations, just like their police counterparts. In New York City, the sheriff's department does basically sort of a different thing. They investigate scofflaw or deficient vehicle fine things, and they also serve orders of protection for the courts. But outside of this, sheriffs do perform patrol functions. Other lesser known agencies, such as campus police departments, uh, we are students and staff at John Jay College. As soon as you walk into John Jay College, who are you met by? Well, you're met by a peace officer, and if you would look at their patches, it's going to say CUNY Police. They are peace officers, and as such, they actually do have arrest powers. So they can effect an arrest on duty in their quote unquote geographical area of employment, which is John Jay and the surrounding perimeter. Such as campus police departments and transit police. Other agencies, other jurisdictions will have their own separate transit police. In New York City, transit police are not different than the NYPD. They are NYPD officers. They are part of what's called the Transit Bureau. So the Transit Bureau is part of the NYPD. Even some public schools have a police presence. Well, in New York City, school safety, at least at one time, was put into the school. Right now, they're looking to take school safety out of the NYPD's operational budget and put it into the Department of Education's operational budget and be guided by that. This has happened in the past, so you could maybe look this up, where in the 80s and 90s school safety was under DOE, or at that time the Board of Education, and there might have been a reason why they went to the NYPD, and there might be valid reasons why they might need to be moved from the NYPD to the DOE. I'm going to skip to slide number 23. This is an important slide for me. Local agencies. We have municipal police, and we have sheriff's departments. What I would like you to do is, right next to municipal police, put in parentheses appointed by an executive. Sheriff's departments, put in parentheses elected. And I want to draw this distinction because in municipal police, they are appointed by whoever the executive is. Now, if we're using New York City as the example, the mayor gets to appoint who he or she wants as their police commissioner. So it's up to the mayor to decide who the police commissioner is. When we're talking about sheriff departments, there is one sheriff. He or she is the executive. He or she is that top box in their organizational chart. That sheriff is elected by a general vote. I draw this distinction because there might be a difference in agendas between municipal police and what sheriffs do. In that, a police commissioner serves the mayor or whoever that executive is, municipal executive, county executive. Sheriffs serve the people. So they might have differing agendas. Maybe people want something, but the mayor has a different philosophy on that. Well, what does the police commissioner do? Well, the police commissioner is probably going to fall in line with what his or her boss says, in this case, the mayor. Sheriffs have to depend on general votes to be voted back in. So that might be something interesting. Local agencies, again, we have more organizational charts. You could take a look at them, but they all sort of look similar. Slide number 28. Now, slide number 28 has a big definition, so I want to go through it. An organization can be defined as a consciously coordinated social entity with a relatively identifiable boundary that functions on a relatively continuous basis to achieve a common goal or sets of goals. Okay, so that's one of these, $10,000 definitions, I like to call them. That someone who coined that probably made $10,000 because it was so clever. And it's so clever because it's so complex, yet it is so easy. What is an organization? Well, an organization is a consciously coordinated social entity. Well, what does that mean? Well, if it is a social entity, what that means is it's comprised of people. An organization is comprised of people. Now, that might sound really simple, but you have to really consider that in order to operate an organization, you need to learn how to manage and supervise people. And there might be a difference between the idea of managing and supervising. We could talk about that later. What is consciously coordinated? Well, if we have a number one, a deputy director, a police commissioner, a sheriff, well, that is being consciously coordinated. On top of that, all of these agencies, as we have said previous, have their own set of core missions and core values that they have to follow with a relatively identifiable boundary. Well, what does the NYPD do? Well, the NYPD basically handles criminal complaints. They might make referrals to civil courts, housing courts, family courts, but really what they do is they handle this idea of criminal complaints. If someone punches me in the face, I'm going to call 911. They're going to take a complaint report. They're going to investigate. If I can point out who the perpetrator is, they're going to effect that arrest. But do police officers, let's say, conduct evictions in New York City? They do not conduct evictions. That would be the purview of the New York City Marshal. Police officers are present there, but they're not present there to perform the eviction. They're just there to preserve the peace, to make sure that the marshal can do his or her job. To be consciously coordinated means that someone or perhaps a group of people is managing the organization. I'm going to skip to slide number 30. How police departments differ from other organizations. Police organizations differ from other organizations in more than just arrest powers and use of force. However, that is a huge responsibility. This idea of being able to arrest a person, to deprive a person of their Fourth Amendment right to privacy, of this Fourth Amendment right to not be seized without probable cause. And this idea that police can use force to accomplish a police objective. Now, notice how I'm phrasing that. They can use force. I'm not saying what type of force yet. That's going to be something to explore in a later chapter. Usually the terms that police can use is necessary, minimal, and or reasonable, or maybe a combination of those words. Their status as public agencies make them quite distinct from the realm of private business. Unlike private organizations, they exist within a political environment, as do other public organizations, such as prosecutors' offices and universities. This idea that public agencies have to respond to public zeitgeist is absolutely true. Here's an example of that. In the last chapter that I uploaded, I talked about People versus DeBoer, and I talked about Terry stops, otherwise known as stop, question, and frisk. In the late 1990s and in the 2000s, stop, question, and frisk was utilized often by the police department as a means of proactively fighting crime. Well, now what had happened? Well, what had happened was that there was this public outcry that the police were possibly overusing this technique of stop, question, and frisk. And there are reasons why they overused it. And the reasons really come back to sort of this agenda of what municipal executives want in the cities that they manage. On or about 2010 to 2013, there was this public outcry against this idea of stop, question, and frisk. So what happened? It got taken to court. It got taken to court, and in New York State, one judge found that it was unconstitutional. Most people know that part. What they don't know is that that judge's ruling was overturned by a higher court. So stop, question, and frisk in New York City, in New York State, is still constitutional. However, it is not performed all that much anymore. And why is that? Because the public doesn't want it anymore. That there was a huge public outcry that the police are abusing this privilege of stop, question, and frisk, and maybe manufacturing reasonable suspicion. They work in the public eye and must follow all the rules applicable to government agencies. They are not run for profit as are private security agencies. They are often hamstrung by bureaucratic rules and regulations that can stifle creativity and flexibility. For those of you that are considering becoming a New York City police officer, just know that their rules and regulations, or their procedural manual called the Patrol Guide, is about 2,400 pages. And as a police officer, you are held accountable to at least have a working knowledge of what's going on in those 2,400 pages in that manual. And if not, you can be held accountable for not knowing that, for doing something wrong. Slide number 31, staff versus line duties. Staff, non-sworn personnel. This is civilian staff, administrators, human resources, things of that nature. Assist line officials. Those are sworn personnel. Things like police officers, court officers, correctional officers. They all swear an oath before they become an officer of either a police department, of a court, or of a correctional facility. Chain of command. Every organization, public or private, follows a chain of command. What this means is if I am a police officer and I need some assistance, I don't get to call the police commissioner. I don't even get to call my commanding officer. Normally, I have to follow the chain of command. So the next level up for me as a police officer, let's say in the NYPD, would be a sergeant. So I talk to this sergeant. Maybe the sergeant doesn't know what to do in a specific instance. What he or she is going to do is follow the chain of command and go to the next higher rank to ask for assistance, in this case, a lieutenant and captain, and so on and so on. Most prosecutor offices are run by an elected district attorney. In New York City, there are 6 district attorneys. 5 of them are voted in. Those 5 are the quote-unquote district attorney. 99% of the time, you as a police officer, probation officer, parole officer, court officer, possibly a corrections officer, are not going to have an audience with the district attorney. What you are going to have, who you're going to have an audience with, is what's known as an ADA, or assistant district attorney. Those are the ones that are in charge of prosecuting cases, investigating cases, things of that nature. In this respect, police agencies, sheriff's departments, and other law enforcement agencies are no different. Someone is in charge, and there is always accountability there. Where law enforcement agencies part ways with others, though, is in this idea of chain of command. I'm going to okay, let's talk about slide number 32. The traditional approach to police organization hails from Sir Robert Peel. Peel was mentioned in an earlier lecture, his 9 principles of policing and what he did. Peel's recommendation that agencies follow a military model. Most police departments, most corrections departments, court officers they consider themselves to be paramilitaristic, that they look like military lines, but there are some subtle differences. One of the first principles Peel espoused was that the police must be stable, efficient, and organized through military lines, meaning you have to be held accountable. Classical organization theory and the problem with classical organizational theory. I just want to quickly talk about a social theorist named Max Weber. It's written Weber. It's pronounced in German Weber. Social theorists disliked the European guild system and disliked personal family style. He didn't want people to have familial ties or friendship ties. He disliked loyalty to individual supervisors. He wanted loyalty to the rank, not to the person. Believe that management should be impersonal. Specific rules and regulations should be followed. Authority derives from function. So it's not that you're my supervisor, it's that you hold the rank of supervisor. This impersonal, objective form of management is called bureaucracy. If you want an example of bureaucracy, head down to your local Department of Motor Vehicles and apply for a driver's license. It's probably going to take you anywhere, if you know a real small one, 40 minutes. If you go to one of the bigger ones, especially the ones in the urban areas, expect anywhere from a 2 to 6 hour wait, and to go from window to window to window. Very impersonal. Each person has a specific function. If you don't fall in line with their specific function, well, you need to go to another window. What is bureaucracy? A well-defined hierarchy of authority. This is that concept of chain of command. Specialization, specific task or organization, formalization, rules and regulations that must be followed to the letter. Impersonality of management decisions are based on the goals of the agency, has nothing to do with the person. Personnel decisions are based on merit, not patronage. So it's really going to be what you know and how you apply what you know, but not about who you know. Slide number 5, take a note of this, might be a test question. As previously discussed, the classical structure, which we just talked about, is typical of most police organization. It is also clear that this model has its limitations. Well, what are those limitations? Well, everything that we've talked about in bureaucracy talks about rank and it talks about structure. But you know what it never talks about? It doesn't talk about people. It doesn't talk about how to effectively manage people. Weber thinks that just by function we can manage people, but we are social people, we are complex individuals. There are certain psychological techniques that need to be employed in order to manage people. Notice I didn't say supervise, manage people. Critics feel that the classical approach is, in a word, mechanistic, that it doesn't discuss the relationships that we form as people. 36, management should engage in a social process. Well, what does that mean? Well, if I'm your manager, yes, I earned that function. But in order for me to earn and keep that function, I need to know how to manage people. Now, some people, maybe they need to be quote unquote stroked a little bit more than other people. Maybe some people are self starters, others are not self starters. I, as an effective manager, need to be able to recognize that and figure out techniques to make the self starter happy and the not so self starter happy as well. Because happy employees are more productive employees. Productive employees create a more productive organization that combine techniques and people to benefit both the organization and the employee. So not only do I want to benefit the place I work, but I want to benefit the people that are under me, because those people that are under me, if they're happy, are going to make me look good. So we're going to talk about two other social theorists. Please take a note of this. Douglas McGregor hypothesized that there were two distinct types of workers. There were Theory X workers and Theory Y workers. Theory X workers are workers that lack ambition. These are your people that are not self-starters. These are your people that, without clear direction and sort of constant direction, will not do the tasks that was asked of them. They are self-centered, non-motivated workers that a watchful eye must be kept on. And then there are Theory Y workers. These are your self-starters. Workers are motivated. They're self-starters. These workers only fail when management does not provide a supportive working environment. Now, the Theory X worker and the person that manages that Theory X workers, they tend to be micromanagers, watching every step of the process. And if there's a problem with one step of the process, well, now they sort of bring the hammer down on that worker. Theory Y is not so, they're interested in the process, but they're more interested in the end result. And they will allow their workers, if they are Theory Y workers, to self-start and be creative and sort of brainstorm ideas to get to that goal. And that's what organizations do. They all have goals that must be met. If you do any research in this, you'll find that in the late 80s, there was another theory. This was the Theory Z type worker posited by a Japanese social theorist named Oichi, where people can work better in sort of groups and then break off from those groups. So you brainstorm together and then break off. I'm more interested really in Theory X and Theory Y, at least for purposes of what law enforcement does. Theory Z really is not applicable to municipal or sort of law enforcement organizations. It's more private company stuff. Second person I want to discuss is Abraham Maslow, a social researcher that discovered that people, workers, but people in general, need more than just security such as stable jobs. They need higher level emotional satisfaction. And Maslow formed what's called his hierarchy of needs. I'm at slide number 39, and this is going to be the last slide. His hierarchy of needs, depending on who you read, sort of brackets the first three together and then the top two together. You could look at the first three sort of as external needs, and then the higher ones, the other two, as sort of internal needs. So the very base level are physiological needs that in order to ascend Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these needs have to be met first. Here's the first one. You have to have air. You have to have air to breathe. Now that might sound simple. It might almost sound counterintuitive, but do you care about anybody else if you can't breathe? Probably not. So we need to have air. We need to have food. We need to have water. We need to have sex. And in this idea of sex, this is not talking about romantic relationships or sexual attachments. What we're talking about is propagating the species. Sleep, homeostasis, meaning that your body is functioning and being able to excrete. So your sort of base needs must be met first before we could start going to the higher levels. Second level, so physiological needs have been met. So now we can ascend to that second level. Safety needs, security of body, of employment, of resources, of morality, of family, health, property. Really, when I think of this, I think of four walls and a roof. So now I have food, I have water, I have a place to excrete. Well, now I want a house. I want an apartment. I want four walls around me. Then the third level, love and belongings. Well, now this is where we start getting these physical, emotional, sexual attachments to other people, because as people, we are social beings. So we need interaction. Without this interaction, for the most part, issues can take place. So friendship, family, sexual intimacy. So this idea of sex in the love and belonging is different than the idea of sex in the physiological. Then we have esteem, self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of your peers. Now we're talking more about internal processes, things that make me happy. Well, I want to feel good about myself. I want to be confident in the things that I do. I want to be respected by my peers. I want to be respected by my students. This highest level, self-actualization, this is sort of having a goal finally get met that you've had most of your life. Morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, lack of prejudice, acceptance of facts. For a lot of my students, since you were young kids, you might have wanted to become a lawyer. You might have wanted to become a police officer, a corrections officer, maybe a police detective. Well, let's just use police officer as an example. You were a kid, you got, a toy set of police, you watched police shows on TV, you absolutely fell in love with it, you loved the uniform, you loved the whole thing. So now you're in the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, you're taking my course, you're going to get an A in the course because I told you all started out with an A. Well, Eventually you're going to graduate, and then maybe you apply for the police department. So you sign up for the exam, you pass the exam, you go through the pre investigation that gets set up. Then you get hired. So you go through the police academy. You successfully complete that police academy, and boom, you are now a police officer. So all your life, you always dreamed of being a police officer, and now you are self actualized because you've met this childhood goal. Well, that is all for this chapter. I thank you for listening to it. Enjoy your day. Take care.